welcome back to episode 4 of the Bugman's View of Fascism. Thanks for sticking with me this far in the series. I know this material isn't too flashy or too entertaining, but it is evergreen, and we're picking this ourselves, and we're choosing to learn about this on our own rather than anyone telling us to do it. So hopefully we've got that in our favor, rather than the other things that are competing for your time and your mental energy. The things in the 24-hour news cycle are definitely being selected by people who do not have your best interests at heart or mine. So maybe if we choose some different things, we might strike out, but we might also get lucky. But we're definitely not working for our masters, our erstwhile masters. Okay, we're going to start from the third paragraph at the top of page 16, where we ended off. Initially, the concern largely of journalists and sensationalists, very soon, the issue of the reappearance of fascism as Neofascism engaged the interest of more serious scholars. And so the domain of journalists, those are the bugmen we're talking about, right? And then the sensationalists, those would be people like the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who make a living by going around and shaking their tin can while threatening everybody and saying, oh my God, Hitler's going to come back and kill everyone. You better donate some money to us. So those are the two groups there who were talking about it, and then it somehow became mainstream. They face the same problems encountered by all those who propose to study novel subject matter, how to circumscribe their specific range of interest and render it intelligible to a reasonably well-informed public. Scholars in informal disciplines such as intellectual history, comparative ideologies, history, or political science employ a variety of strategies to demarcate the proper range of their subject matter. So what he's saying is that people in those fields, you can kind of go wherever you want. You can, there's so many things that fall under the broad heading of history or political science that you can kind of study whatever you want under those things. But they have some strategies to help demarcate it. They sometimes provide their audience a lexical definition, declaring an obscure term or concept synonymous with others more familiar. Thus, the unfamiliar or obscure term fascism might be defined as, quote, the open, terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialistic elements of finance capital, end quote. Let's see where that citation was from. The 13th plenary meeting of the Executive Committee of the Communist International in 1933, repeated in the editorial of the World Marxist Review, 1962, published in book form as The New Fascist Danger, 1962. Okay, so that's just a straightforward Marxist propagandistic definition from the 1930s. Let's read that again. The open, terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialistic elements of finance capital, which is, given the history of Bolshevism, it's quite amusing because you have the Warburgs financing Lenin, right? I think it's the German Warburgs are financing Lenin, and then Jacob Schiff is financing Trotsky. So it's quite amusing. Finance capital. Wow. Such a definition is generally unpacked into a fairly complex notion of a relationship between quote-unquote big business and quote-unquote fascist political agents doing their bidding. So we already talked about this in prior episodes. This is the Marxist line on what fascism is. It's a dog's body of the big business capitalist financiers. The lexical definition is often a quote-unquote carrier for a fairly intricate quote-unquote theory of socioeconomic political dynamics. Without considering the problems that attend any such theories, it is obvious that even the simplest of such definitions involve considerable reworking. Critical terms like quote-unquote big business, familiar in ordinary speech, require precision if they are to be employed in any serious inquiry. What distinguishes a quote-unquote big business from any other kind of business? What can quote-unquote chauvinism be taken to mean in order that it can be observed with certainty? What is the observable reference for quote-unquote finance capitalism? Without even addressing the question of how one might confirm the claim that finance capitalists promote, foster, and sustain fascism, it is clear that lexical definitions are actually very complex cognitive undertakings. And so this is, if you want to go from just studying politics to doing political science, for instance, this is your job. This is what you have to do. You've got to take these concepts and you have to what they say operationalize them. So you've got to figure out concrete, reproducible, very firm, explicable definitions for what is a big business. Is it a business with employees over a certain amount? Is it publicly traded? Is it got a market capitalization over a certain value? Does it have board members who sit on the boards of other companies over a certain value? You could come up with an infinite variety of characteristics that you think explains big business. And that's what separates something like political science from journalism, in that the political scientist is actually trying to be understood and trying to find the truth, hopefully, as an ideal, of course. In academia, this hardly ever happens, but just as an ideal out there. So you're going to come up with some strict, hard, fast, reproducible definitions, and then you're going to test that by seeing if the real world conforms to the hypothesis that comes out of this Marxist theory. So it totally could be done, easily could be done. Well, not easily, but it would require a lot of work, but it definitely could be done. In fact, what the journalist or the Marxist does, the Bugman, they just say, yes, it happened, and then they go find one or two examples of how it happened, and then they're just done. They're just finished. And if you disagree with them or argue with them, they'll just go and start calling you a Hitlerite or just ad hominem attacks, basically. So what he's doing as a serious person, what Gregor's doing as a serious person and a serious academic and an honest man, is telling you that if you really wanted to pursue this kind of theory, this is how you would have to do it. In effect, lexical definitions often require considerable explication before they become serviceable for historical or social science research. The familiarity of terms employed does not, in and of itself, ensure their utility in empirical, quantitative research, particularly when the entire exercise rests on social science conjectures about complex empirical relations. So he's saying you can't just get away with this vague idea that we might both share about fascism or what big business is. You just can't do that. It's not going to work. At times, historians and researchers offer criterial definitions, identifying their subject matter by providing a reasonably discrete catalog of observable properties that identify members of the class under scrutiny. So this is what I was talking about with big business, where you come up with this list that you think describes it. Those would be your criteria. Thus, the members of the committees of inquiry of the European Parliament. So what he said earlier in this is that there was an EU group from, I think, like 1999, 98, 99, and they did a study and released a paper called Fascism in Europe, and it was all about anti-immigrant sentiment and racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia and all this kind of stuff. So the members of the committees of inquiry of the European Parliament chose to identify those groups that they deemed anti-Semitic and or xenophobic to be, quote-unquote, fascist. Criterial definitions share some fundamental traits with those lexical in character. although the defining properties used in criterial definitions are directly observable in principle, quote-unquote xenophobic or quote-unquote anti-Semitic behavior has to be operationally defined. So again, just like with what we just talked about, if you're gonna employ these terms like xenophobia or anti-Semitism, you're going to have to come up with a hard and fast list of what constitutes xenophobia, what constitutes anti-Semitism. And what we invariably see in practice is that the Jewish groups are just the worst about this. So the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Simon Wiesenthal Center or, the ADL, right? Any of these Jewish groups, what they do is they'll say anti-Semitism, and then they'll look at a list of events that happened, and they'll classify them as anti-Semitic, but they really stay away from hard and fast definitions of the term itself because they want to use the Potter Stewart pornography way of doing business, where I know anti-Semitism when I see it, but I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to define the boundaries of this term up front, because then you'll just endeavor not to do whatever those boundaries are, or those boundaries themselves will be exposed as ridiculous, so they have no benefit from defining it. They merely characterize things post hoc as anti-Semitism. And, it's the same way with racism, right? So any of these anti-white psychological control terms like xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, all this stuff doesn't get defined up front because either the white population would reject those definitions, or they would just find ways to go about them. So in order to achieve the social control on the white European population, you have to have vague, flimsy definitions, and then just continually ratchet up the intensity of the social control. E. Michael Jones, for instance, has made jokes, like wry jokes over time about the evolution of the term anti-Semitism. Like anti-Semitism used to mean that you wanted to either kill Jews or, purge them somehow. You wanted to just completely get rid of them from your society. That was anti-Semitism. Then anti-Semitism became just harboring inner feelings about dislike for Jews, but not even trying to do anything actively against them. And now we're to the point where merely disagreeing with Jews is anti-Semitic. Like, for example, if you don't think that Jews should be able to either keep the Palestinians in an apartheid type situation, or that they should just be able to genocide Palestinians or purge them from the boundaries of the Zionist entity in Palestine, then you're anti-Semitic. So whatever Jews don't like is anti-Semitic, is E. Michael Jones's criticism. So we're kind of moving, like in a circle around this issue, talking about operationalizing xenophobia and anti-Semitism. Back to the text after that long excursus. Anti-Semitic or xenophobic behavior is not always patently obvious. Well, the social justice warriors would disagree, right? Two observers might well disagree as to whether or not what they both observed was anti-Semitic or xenophobic. The advantage criterial definitions enjoy turns on the fact that such definitions do not necessarily rest upon any particular theoretical foundation. So the idea is that if you come up with a criterial your list of criteria for what constitutes anti-Semitism, xenophobia, fascism, big business, whatever it happens to be, then it doesn't matter. If you're a liberal and I'm a Marxist and this guy over here is a fascist, we can all employ those same criteria to define the phenomena in question. So you get away from the theoretical foundations once you move to the criterial stuff. Such definitions only require that the criterial properties that serve to identify members of a class be, in principle, empirically observable and ideally quantifiable. So you got to be able to identify them and count them. You got to be able to see them. Other than that, you're pretty much good to go. The most singular feature of the evolving study of Neofascism has been the lack of any consistency in defining the subject of inquiry. For decades after the war, European Marxists were disposed to identify any anti-communist political movement of whatever ideological persuasion as quote-unquote neo-fascist. Because they were anti-communist, such political manifestations were, by definition, quote-unquote reactionary. That was because Marxists entertained the quote-unquote scientific conviction that the workers' revolution was ineluctable, and that whenever and wherever, quote, a social revolution is pending, and for whatever reason is not accomplished, reaction is the alternative, end quote. So from the Marxist perspective, there is the liberal bourgeois or authoritarian bourgeois precursor society, so either Imperial Germany or Imperial Russia. And then there is a workers' revolt, and then there is a reaction to the workers' revolt. And that's pretty much the only thing that can happen in the Marxist worldview. And either the revolutionary people succeed, as they supposedly did in Imperial Russia, revolting against Kerensky and his liberal Freemasonic clique, or as in Imperial Germany, interwar Germany, just the couple years after the end of the war, the local, the local anti-communist militias managed to round up and shoot all the Bolsheviks before they take power, which is what did happen in Germany. So that's the Marxist view of things. It's revolution or reaction. And since fascism and these movements are anti-communist, they're reaction by definition, and therefore they're fascist by definition, etc., etc. Since the advocates of quote-unquote progressive communism were of the political quote-unquote left, Neofascism, as reactionary and anti-communist, must of necessity be of the quote-unquote right. Such characterizations, however anachronistic, had been made familiar by the Marxist literature of the pre-war and wartime period, and soon became standard in accounts devoted to Neofascism. So what I've been arguing and what I've been noticing a lot is that the stuff that he's talking about here, he's saying that the study of Neofascism just picked up the Marxist line, okay? And that's what we see in a lot of places when you start looking in the historical record. You see modern liberals echoing anti-fascist communism of the 1930s and 40s. And quite often it seems like they don't even know they're doing it. And then the saddest of all is that you'll see the conservatives pick up the same stuff, because too often the conservatives are completely and utterly ignorant of the history of their own country, of the world, of political ideologies. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. The conservative ideology is just, in German, they have this characterization of the Protestant Swabian subgroup of the German people as being house builders. So they're just concerned with building up their little domestic empire that they're building, and they're not concerned with the higher things. And so that's a really good example of the conservative ideology. You're sitting there building up your own little domestic empire. You're not worried about the political situation in your country, and you're really scared to take personal risks because that would destroy your investment. Whereas people who are radicals, people who are revolutionaries and reactionaries, they're not so concerned about building up their little household empire, and they are willing to take risks. That's why during the Bolshevik coup in 1917, 1918, you had 20,000 Bolsheviks take over St. Petersburg, a city that had 4 million people in it. And most of those 4 million people were bourgeois or above. They certainly weren't workers. They weren't peasants. There were tons and tons and tons of middle-class people and people with money who were living in that city who just sat and cowered while those, disgusting murderers took over the country and then proceeded to slaughter and expropriate all those people who were cowering. So, I mean, that's the conservative mindset. You really don't want to stick your neck out. Anyhow, sorry about that about conservatives, but that's just the truth there. So the sad thing is that the conservatives are falling right in with the liberals, the progressives, and the Marxists with a lot of this recycling of this stuff from the 30s and 40s. Soon the term Neofascism, quote-unquote, came to refer to any organization that hosted conservatives, free market enthusiasts, fundamental Christians, and almost anyone of any political persuasion whatsoever, as long as they were anti-communist, that is, right-wing. So yeah, the real tragedy of the conservative stuff is that they then end up in the same situation that they're often in with regards to racism, where the so-called conservatives are trying even harder than liberals and progressives to prove that they're not racist. Who cares? Why do you care what a liberal or a progressive or a Marxist think? Whether they think that you're racist or not. The conservative is so short-sighted and naive that they can't understand that the liberal, the Marxist, and the progressive don't care whether the conservative has proved themselves not to be a racist. They're usually proved to be a racist merely by their skin color and their bank account, right? So that's the problem. So, but anyhow, in this worldview, the conservatives, the libertarians, everybody, they all get lumped together into the fascist group merely because they're anti-Marxist or they're cultural Marxist or anti-globalist or whatever. Frequently, that came to mean that any individual or organization that was anti-communist was neo-fascist. And it's obvious. I mean, this is it's patently ridiculous, but this is what people said, and this is basically what you got today. By the end of the 1960s, more serious work would undermine their notions. Many researchers had settled on a slightly more sophisticated Marxist interpretation of fascism in general and neo-fascism in particular. There were those who argued that while fascism may have been the consequence of the intervention into the political by the, quote, economic ruling class, end quote, of post-World War I Italy, seeking to, quote, survive and strengthen its own position, end quote, they were equally prepared to grant that it was, quote unquote, absurd to pretend that Mussolini was, quote, merely the material executor of orders issued by the Italian industrialists, end quote. The rule of, quote unquote, big business was rather more subtle and, quote unquote, dialectical. For all that, the Marxist notion persisted that fascism and neo-fascism remained servants of moribund capitalism, and as such were quote-unquote rightist and quote-unquote reactionary. I'm going to take a short break. I'll be right back. Okay, resuming where we left off. The quasi-Marxist net was cast so wide that not only did General Francisco Franco qualify as a fascist, but so did General Charles de Gaulle, as did the Ku Klux Klan, the John Birch Society, and, quote-unquote, near-fascists such as Barry Goldwater. We were told at the time that Goldwater's quote-unquote ambition was to restore the America of the 1920s, or perhaps even the America of 1898, before the days of Teddy Roosevelt, end quote. Which would probably be the best thing for everybody in the entire world, Americans and non-Americans included, but I don't think that's going to happen without a big catastrophe. But we can be hopeful. In a textbook case of circular reasoning, we were told that Goldwater must have been a neo-fascist since he was supported by neo-fascists everywhere. This is the same thing with Trump, right? Trump had to be a fascist or a neo-fascist because David Duke supported him or something like that. Or Trump must want to hang all blacks in America because David Duke supports him, even though David Duke doesn't advocate violence. So, figure that out. Thus, while specialists like Renzo Di Felice and Ernst Nolte were putting together an account of fascism that served to disqualify the variety of Marxist interpretations then prominent in the intellectual environment of the West, some of those who were searching out Neofascism lapsed back into some of the least persuasive of the wartime renderings of what fascism, and by implication what Neofascism, was supposed to be. At about the same time that some authors were reconfirming that fascism was simply a tool of industrialists and financiers, there was developing in the Soviet Union a modified interpretation of fascism. Fascism was no longer to be understood as a simple instrument of the possessing classes. Fascism might also be a weapon in the arsenal of quote-unquote pseudo-socialist, quote-unquote petty bourgeois governments, pseudo-socialist petty bourgeois governments that controlled, even if they pretended not to own, property. In effect, by the mid-1970s, Soviet thinkers had discovered that Chinese Maoism, for all its pretended left-wing convictions, was actually of the quote-unquote right, a variant of European fascism. This light is coming in through the window. I gotta go close this. For Soviet theoreticians, Maoists were in fact neo-fascists. They were irrational, nationalistic, aggressive, militaristic, and ruled by a quote-unquote chairman who pretended to trans-rational wisdom, whose every word was conceived true, and who was to be obeyed whether citizens understood his orders or not. It was in that parlous state that the burgeoning study of neo-fascism continued through much of the 1970s. Toward the end of the decade, Alexander Yanov called the academic community's attention to the fact that quote-unquote rightists were making their appearance in the leadership circles of the Soviet Union. This is important to note here, and this is something that people have a lot of arguments about, so let's read that again and pay particularly close attention to this part. It was in that parlous state that the burgeoning study of neo-fascism continued through much of the 1970s. Toward the end of the decade, Alexander Yanov called the academic community's attention to the fact that quote-unquote rightists were making their appearance in the leadership circles of the Soviet Union. They were those who were unmitigated nationalists, etatists, and authoritarians who sought the quote-unquote Russification of the entire population of the Union. They spoke of will as a major determinant of human performance, of the role of ethnicity in the affairs of civilization, and of hierarchy as part of the natural order of things. For Yanov, they were, in effect, Russian neo-fascists. Suddenly, there were right-wing extremists, that is, neo-fascists, at the highest levels not only of the Chinese Communist Party, but of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as well. Members of what the Western academic community had long characterized as the quote-unquote revolutionary left had transformed themselves into right-wing neo-fascists. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and the disagreement that I referred to just a moment ago is what happened to the Soviet Union over the course of its 70, 80-year history. The Bolshevik Revolution the Bolshevik coup was carried out by a bunch of internationalists who were, let's say they were 35 to 40% Jewish, 35 to 40% ethnic Russian or Ukrainian, and then the other 20% was Polish, Latvian, Lithuanian, Tatar, just all the other ethnic groups in that area. So they started out internationalist. They decriminalized homosexuality. They decriminalized abortion, and they set about destroying traditional Russian religious life, communal life, all that stuff. Now, from about 1933, I think, onward, which is also, the Gulag was running just as strong as it ever was, and maybe even peaked at that time. I'm not quite sure in terms of its brutality. But from 1933 onward, from 1937 onward, and certainly from 1941 onward, the Soviet Union started to become more nationalist. And it had to become more nationalist because Bolshevism, especially the pure, unmitigated Bolshevism that was enacted right after the Russian Civil War, during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and up until 1925 and 26, is just completely corrosive to human life. No society can withstand full, unmitigated Bolshevism. So the people in charge of the Soviet Union pretty much had a choice. Do you want to be ruling a heap of ashes, or do you want to be ruling, more or less a country that you can still extract resources from and live as a privileged class? And for the most part, they chose the latter. And the hardcore people, the real extremist radical types, they were purged. They were either kicked out of the country like Trotsky, or they were killed like most of the other people. And so it's Matthew Raphael Johnson completely rejects the hypothesis that Stalin was a nationalist of any kind or another. And, you should understand that Stalin was one of the old Bolsheviks, so he completely agreed with the radical internationalist Bolshevik plan that was implemented early on. But it seems to me like he did implement some of those policies once he got some of the nationalist policies once he got in power. I think not because he was a nationalist himself, but just because he didn't have any other choice. If you still want to be ruling a country, you've just got to do some of this stuff because the other policies are impossible to implement in the long term. And that's why the cultural Marxists and the globalists who are in power today do everything really slowly. Right? They've been doing basically the same policy that they have going today. They've been implementing it since 1965 and all the way back to 1920, 1930, right? But they do things slowly because they saw what happened in the Soviet Union. So this nationalism, especially after Stalin died, more and more ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, as opposed to Jews and other types of people who were running the Bolshevik group originally, more and more ethnic Russians and Ukrainians were in the leadership structure of the Soviet Union. And so it's my understanding, it's my hypothesis that just simply due to that, with all of the non-Russian elements slowly being purged out of the administration as they either die or retire or get killed by someone else, eventually the Soviet government started tending back towards National Bolshevism. So total state control of everything, but not internationalist and not trying to destroy Russian traditional life. And I've seen, when I was in St. Petersburg, I was looking at some of the old churches there. And so you can follow this change in the course of history just by looking at the churches. So in the 1920s, the old Bolsheviks who were running things, who were basically all not all Jews, but atheistic Russians and then a bunch of Jews basically, they used all of these beautiful old churches to store potatoes and to put hay for horses and all this kind of stuff. They just trashed them. Well, by the 1960s, the Russian government was actually spending its money to refurbish these churches, right? So the officially atheistic Soviet Union, 1960s and 70s, is devoting its valuable time and resources to, renovating and refurbishing these churches. So to me, that doesn't really look like a propaganda move to try to build up, some type of rapport with the Russian people by the elite. I think it's just generally that the people who were getting in power were just tending back towards their own native, healthy nationalism. And so even though the Soviet Union was an evil, monstrous thing throughout its entire existence, it did tend back towards equilibrium. And it appears to me that the same thing has probably happened in China. Mao, once he died and his pernicious and destructive influence was finally terminated, the Han Chinese seem to have moved back towards the Han Chinese leadership, the paramount ethnic group in China, has just tended back towards Han Chinese nationalism with some imperialism mixed in. So that's, I think those were the points I wanted to make about that section. But that's, it's just really contentious stuff. It's really, really contentious because the history is confusing and you're observing people doing a lot of stuff that they shouldn't be doing. So according to their official labels, I'm trying to say. Okay, we'll pick up at the last second full paragraph on page 19. By the beginning of the 1980s, Neofascism was apparently to be found almost everywhere in the world, on the right and on the left. One or another author found Neofascism pullulating in the United States among right-wing extremists, fundamentalist Christians, and Republicans. In Angola, where Marxist revolutionaries faced quote-unquote neo-fascist mercenaries. In Bolivia, where peasants were oppressed by the quote-unquote fascist Hugo Bonser. In Brazil, where the quote-unquote fascist regime sought to murder the members of the vanguard of the popular revolution. In Chile, where General Augusto Pinochet led his quote-unquote fascist helicopter forces against democratic Chileans. Just kidding, it didn't actually say helicopter. I just wanted to make sure you were paying attention. Led his fascist quote-unquote forces against democratic Chileans. In Fidel Castro's Cuba, which was a quote typical case of a fascio-communism or national communism, end quote. Read that. Let's read that again. In Fidel Castro's Cuba, which was a quote typical case of a fascio-communism or national communism, end quote. That's like we would say national Bolshevism. And in India, where the government was attempting to impose a quote fascist dictatorship, end quote, on the people. Scholars plying their trade in the subdiscipline of fascist studies were doing land office business. They're invading new territory and selling it, right? Setting up franchises. The 1980s saw the beginnings of a transformation that would fundamentally modify the intellectual environment. Mikhail Gorbachev would attempt to reform the lumbering institutions of what the Soviet Union had become. Among those reforms was an effort at glasnost, or openness, permission for the public discussion of political issues. By the mid-1980s, Soviet academicians were attempting to analyze the origins, nature, and scope of the Soviet tragedy, and Marxism-Leninism's complete failure to realize any of the revolutionary goals advertised by Bolshevism in 1917. One of my favorite comparisons to make to help me think about the disgusting and polluted intellectual environment that we live in today is to think about how easily it is for a modern academic living in America to get completely railroaded out of their job or to get sent to the basement or having their teaching courses taken away from them. If they talk about race, if they talk about, what would you say, Jewish power, any of this kind of stuff is just totally off limits. Even being a conservative, as I said before, would just make you a pariah in the academic environment. But one of the worst things is that cultural Marxism and liberalism are the only acceptable lenses by which to interpret history and social science. And it is just as bad, apparently, as the worst times in the Soviet Union, when Marxism-Leninism was decreed by the state as the only acceptable economic, political, and historical philosophy. And it looks like in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was more open than America and the West is today. We are more highly regulated in academia than the Soviet Union was in the 1980s, because they were actually allowed to criticize Marxism-Leninism, which had been, completely illegal, I'm sure, before 1970, definitely. But the reason, of course, is that Mikhail Gorbachev was getting ready to do a switch over to liberal democracy in the Soviet Union so that the whole thing could be expropriated by the West and Wall Street. So it's not an unmitigated good, but it is just very important to point out how, for 60 years in the Soviet Union, Marxism-Leninism was the only acceptable philosophy, and today everybody agrees it was garbage. It was, not useful. Let's read his quote again here. And Marxism-Leninism's complete failure to realize any of the revolutionary goals advertised by Bolshevism in 1917. So that's an 0 for 10. They did nothing. They accomplished absolutely nothing of what they said they were going to do. There was an attempt to understand both the mass murder of innocents by the quote-unquote proletarian dictatorship, as well as the existence of a monstrous archipelago of camps in which so many workers and peasants lost part or all of their lives. Soviet social scientists lamented the emergence of an, quote, administrated society, end quote, in the Soviet Union, lacking democratic opportunities and burdened by a quote-unquote leadership principle, like Führerprinzip, that reduced all decisions to executive fiat. They spoke of the complete abandonment of, quote, socialist principles, end quote, by Stalin, who had lapsed into complete, quote-unquote, irrationality. A man who employed, quote, violence as an indispensable component of unlimited power, end quote. But like Matt Johnson's pointed out, in this regard, in terms of these domestic policies and the way they actually kept power, Stalin was no different from Lenin, and Trotsky was really no different than those two. And to a large part, they were just carrying out what Marx himself said. So in the 80s and 90s, and even after Khrushchev took power, there was this huge deal about just trying to blame everything on Stalin to try to salvage the reputation of the USSR, communism, and Marxism, Leninism in general. But it's kind of dumb, in my opinion. For Stalin, violence had served as a universal tool. Such a leader was not only cruel, but gave every evidence of being a quote-unquote neo-fascist as well. Given their evident disillusion, Soviet historians came to acknowledge the pervasive similarities that constituted the empirical basis for the use of the term quote-unquote totalitarianism to cover Italian fascism, German National Socialism, and Stalinism. In effect, the right-left distinction so labored by Western historians and social scientists for so long a period no longer appeared as persuasive as it once did. Under the evolving circumstances, it became increasingly difficult to identify the quote-unquote progressive features that had made the Soviet Union quote-unquote left-wing for so long a period, while fascism, far less totalitarian, was to be identified as a quote-unquote reactionary or quote-unquote right-wing aberrancy. Some of the informal logic of the study of neo-fascism had been seriously compromised. So what he's saying is that once all of the defenders, internal and external, of Soviet Marxism kind of fell away, and the other big thing that happened during this time was that the international Jewish community because of the foundation of the State of Israel and the rise of Jewish power in America and the immigration of millions more Jews to America in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. International Jewish power stopped supporting the Soviet Union for the most part and stopped supporting communism. And these guys right here but were anti-communist. So all of the people who had been defending communism against all of these true charges of its malfeasance, its murders, its tortures, its slave labor camps, all of the northeastern white Christian, like waspy Anglo stock in America who had been communist, most of those were dead. They were dead or they were getting really old by this point. So they weren't around to defend communism like they used to. And then the Jews now had Israel and the United States as their playground for politics. And as we know, Joseph Stalin, after he purged the old Bolsheviks from 1937 to 1940, we'll say, 33 to 40 really, he purged a lot of Jews. And of course he wasn't anti-Semitic really, but the fact that the party was so Jewish meant that, a lot of these Jews got removed. And so Jewish influence in the Soviet Union declined markedly after 1937, we'll say. But it still took a couple of generations for all of the Jews in America to either become anti-communist neoconservatives or to move to Israel or to just be done with Marxism in general. So there's always that hard core that remains, both in the Jewish and non-Jewish American elites, but they really move away from Soviet Marxist-Leninist economic Marxism to cultural Marxism at that time. And the globalists, of course, they decide that they're going to use the American empire and NATO to push their agenda rather than the international communist takeover, which I think was probably what they were thinking even as late as 1948 in Wallace's campaign for president in the United States. Him and all these other guys around him were saying that they needed to have a globalist union of the United States and the USSR. So by 1970 and 80, these people are dying off or they're no longer influential. So the truth is coming out and we're having a fair accounting of the record of, let's say, Italian fascism and Soviet communism. And it looks like Mussolini's fascism, by comparison, is benign and not totalitarian. And then you're left wondering, well, what the hell makes the Soviet Union left-wing by this comparison? By the criticisms of the 1930s and 40s, it looks like the Soviet Union should have been called the reactionary right-wing state, and the Italian fascists were the true heir to the Marxist vision, for instance. It rapidly became reasonably clear. I'm sorry, I think I missed something. Some of the informal, it had been seriously compromised. So why it had been compromised, I just tried to explain it. There was very little that could be charged to Mussolini's fascism that was not more convincingly true of the Soviet Union. And so again, the Marxist only really has two responses to this. They either ignore it or they lie. And, those are the two main responses. Or appeal to emotion and sentimentality, which is what they do with females for the most part. There was very little that could be charged to Mussolini's fascism that was not more convincingly true of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was as nationalistic, as irredentist, as militaristic, as etatist, which means statist, that's the French word for state, as oppressive, as violative of human and political rights as ever was fascist Italy. It rapidly became reasonably clear that the lines of distinction between left and right-wing quote-unquote extremists were neither easy to draw nor defend. There were very few, quote, who could deny in good conscience that the important features were common to fascist and communist rule. So, end quote. So everybody in good conscience had to understand that these important features were common to both, and therefore you can't really vilify fascism and make excuses for Marxist communism, which, of course, as we've talked about repeatedly, that was what everybody did from the 30s through the 50s and what they're doing again today. It had become evident that the properties customarily, I think I missed a sentence. Yeah. The consequence was that it became increasingly difficult to provide a working definition of quote-unquote neo-fascism that might serve the purposes of historiographic and social science research. It had become evident that the properties customarily assigned neo-fascism were properties shared with Marxist systems on the left. Okay, I don't know how long we've been going. We'll go ahead and stop here. We're stopping at the beginning of the first full paragraph on page 21. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. And I'll talk to you again, hopefully soon.